I want to make a quick note to listeners that there is some frank discussion of violence and death in this episode, which was really necessary to tell the story. Ga was born during wartime in Southeast Asia 50 years ago. Eventually, Minnesota became home. And lately, the two have felt similar.
I have panic attacks now, just from hearing sirens, from seeing people that are in uniform, from just having my neighbors and my own children knock on the door. Um, I have a lot of trauma and fear of being separated from my own children. Um, and then I have these flashbacks, and I know they're not my own, and I wonder if I received them from like just collecting stories by this emotional flashbacks of being in the jungle, being in the camp.
Welcome to In This Family, presented by Nexus Family Healing. I'm Dr. Michelle K. Murray, President and CEO. Ka Vang is a writer and business leader in the Twin Cities. She writes a column for the Minnesota Star Tribune, focusing on marginalized communities. And she's the Vice President of Equity and Community Impact at the organization Meet Minneapolis. She's also been a playwright and children's book author. And Ka Vang, spelled Kavang, is a Hmong-American, part of the 100,000 members of that community living in the Twin Cities. Ga is 50 now. She came to America in 1980 at the age of 5. As you may know, the Twin Cities have been the focus of a great deal of activity by ICE, Immigration and Customs Enforcement. The sudden arrests, relocation to detention facilities, and deportations have frightened many in the Hmong community who are reminded of what happened half a century ago. Ka Vang, thank you so much for being with us on In This Family.
Thank you, Michelle, for having me here today. I appreciate it.
I want to get into mental health and I want to talk about the ICE presence in Minnesota. But first, can you tell me about where you were born and tell me about your parents and your early life?
Sure. Well, I am, I guess they would say, a point five generation. So I came here when I was 5 years old. I was born on a CIA military base in the plains of Jar in Laos. My dad was a major for the U.S. Secret Army in the Secret War.
So I know that this will be hard to do, but could you briefly tell us what the Secret War was?
The Secret War was a war that was happening at the same time as the Vietnam War. Most Americans are very familiar with the Vietnam War. What they don't know is that at the same time the Vietnam War was happening, there was a secret war that was funded by the United States government, led by the CIA, where they were recruiting Hmong men mostly to fight against the Viet Congs, the Pathet Laos, and the communist Lao government. There was not only the Hmongs, but there were also other indigenous groups that were fighting either for the communists or for the Americans. And the Hmong certainly fought for both sides. And the Hmong people that are here in Minnesota are the ones that fought for the Americans, who kept really strict records of who was fighting for them. So if you did not fight for them, you're not in the United States. My first memories were really that of like pain and chaos and confusion. I was born in April 28, 1975. If you know what was happening that spring, the United States was pulling out of Vietnam, of Cambodia. And so before I was 30 days old, my parents told me that the country exploded, because that's the only way that you could describe that kind of chaos, is that something that you know, your life, your land, your family, it just all explodes. And so my father, who was an officer in the secret army, was already safe in Thailand, because as an officer, I guess that was what was asked of him. And he had told my mom, sent messages to her saying that it was done. The United States was pulling out, and there was going to be carnage, death, and that she had to run for her life. That there was a plane that was coming to pick up people, I guess you would say, from that 1 or 10% of the Hmong community, and she was expected to be on that plane. It was supposed to be a secret, but by the time she got to the base and the planes, but the airport, it wasn't so much a secret because there was just thousands of people already there, and so there was American pilots and planes that came to get just a handful of people, but everybody was rushing to the plane, and actually only one plane made it out of Long Chang, which is the CIA military base that my parents were living in, and my mom was actually on one of those planes. And so my mom, who was 19 years old at that time, describes, a situation where, she gets to the airport, she's running towards the plane, and so is everybody else, and she actually gets trampled on. And so she's carrying me on her back, and everybody's running over us, and she's thinking, I'm gonna die, because just the pure pressure of thousands of feet on her back. And finally she felt a hand just pull her up, and then she felt a body just pull her up, and it was actually a distant uncle of ours, and he just told her to run. So he actually helped her run. And when they got to where the plane is, and I don't know anything about military planes, but it's a kind of plane where it opens from the back and you can drive vehicles up of it. So that hatch was already closing, and that uncle actually just threw my mom into the closing hatch and saved our lives, essentially. That uncle eventually did make it out of Laos with his family, but he could have saved himself, but he decided to save my mother and myself that day. And so that was like the beginning of my life. Total chaos, total carnage. And then there was the first 5 years in a refugee camp. And I think when people think of like the refugee situation, they think it's like a bad situation, like staying at a Motel 6, like not nice accommodations. But people don't know that there's real violence that exists in refugee camps. And most of the victims of the violence that exists in refugee camps are actually women and children. So there's prostitution in refugee camps. There's death, there's illness, and that was actually my first memories. I actually remember a boy that I used to play with who lived just, I guess, down the road, because there wasn't real streets, or two, his name. We would play together, and then two disappeared one day, and I realized that there was a lot of children like two, because you would have illness and outbreaks, and then like you would have whole sections of people that lived in the refugee camp, whole families that would just die, and then they just disappear. I know my mom talks about this, and she cries when she talks about this, but that she found me eating garbage, because we're so hungry. So basically, I was eating garbage from the people who didn't have food. It's garbage. So there was nothing to really eat in the garbage, but I was just eating whatever I can find in the garbage, because I was just so hungry. So that was my first, experience in coming to the United States in 1980, and when I was 5 years old. I still have so many habits that I do today because of poverty, because poverty and violence really informed my first few years as a human being. That there are so many things. For example, I don't use sheets on my beds, and I don't sleep with pillows, because I never had sheets or pillows. And when I married my husband, we moved in together before we got married, he was mystified that I didn't use sheets, because that's just not what I knew. And I was mystified that he actually had 3-4 sheets. He had his fitted sheet, and then he had his flat sheet, and then a comforter, and sometimes he had a duvet. It just seemed really odd to me that somebody would need so many sheets to sleep in. And so I just use those as like really like examples of like of I guess the trauma that I carry today, and the imprint that those first few years of my life still impact the decisions I make today, and just how I live my life. So I'm very fortunate to live in the Twin Cities, because there's about 100,000 Hmong people that live here, and I feel a real community. I'm also very fortunate because both my parents survived the war, and almost everybody in our family survived the war. We didn't have any casualties, but I think a lot of that has to do with class and education. My dad was one of the first Hmong people to get an education, a formal education, and one of the first people to actually learn how to speak English. And so he definitely already had a leg up. He definitely had people who were in positions of influence that were helping us come to the United States. But even that, it didn't shield us from like the pain and the suffering.
Can you explain a little more what you meant by people don't really know what a refugee camp is like?
I think that when you don't understand something, you choose to use, I guess, things in your life that make sense. And so,
Yes.
and I use the Motel 6 example because when I was in college and talking with I guess I would say that somebody that's very Minnesotan, so a really waspy friend of mine from one of the classes, and she was like, but isn't it like, she said something to the effect of, yeah, I know, I've been in really terrible like living conditions. I mean, I stayed at a Motel 6. And so I use that as an example because people think that, maybe the worst living experience that they've had is having the unfortunate position of staying at a Motel 6. And what I try to convey to people is that it's worse than a Motel 6. It's actually a nightmare on earth. You're waiting in long lines for a little pieces of food, little morsels of food. You're waiting in long lines to get water, which is basic. You're waiting in long lines to hopefully leave the country, and then and you get to another country where you're going to be safe and secure. I remember that being in the refugee camp and being so young too. I saw somebody actually be raped and murder a young woman. She was very beautiful, and I mean when I look back, she seemed so grown up, and now looking back, she must have been maybe 15 or 16, and she was raped, and because there was ashamed from her being raped, her father actually tied her up at the in the kind of the community square, and overnight she was murdered. Somebody killed her, and my mom and my dad told me that she was probably she had committed suicide from the shame of being raped. And dishonoring her family. But I just think, how could somebody who's tied up, even as a kid, how can somebody who's tied up kill themselves? So, just all sorts of things that you see in the refugee camps. That's why I have a lot of compassion for people
Yeah.
who've had that refugee or an immigrant experience. And I think that war refugees are very different than people who are immigrants. Certainly, we are displaced people, but it's a whole different experience leaving your country and then coming here. My mother actually says that she talks about not wanting to leave her country. She's like, I had clothes in my my native country. She's like, I had servants, I had people to take care of me, and then I came to the United States and started cleaning hotel rooms in downtown Chicago. And so I think a lot of people think that we're all clamoring to come to the United States, but that's not true. A lot of us, especially those people from war, were driven out of our country.
How did you come to be in Minnesota?
Minnesota has always had a reputation in immigrant communities as being very welcoming, and we see that. It has one of the largest Somali communities, one of the largest East African communities in the United States, and of course one of the largest Hmong communities. So, and I am kind of working backwards because we actually arrived in the United States in December in the Midwest in Chicago. Really kind of like one of those like Oliver Stone kind of movies where you're arriving and we got flip flops, no coats, and so we arrive at O'Hare to Chicago because my father was eventually sponsored by his two younger brothers who came to the United States right away in 1975. So 5 years later, they were able to become citizens and were able to sponsor my father and my mother. We get to Chicago, and my father, actually, because of his English speaking abilities, was able to find a job at a social service nonprofit in Rockford. And my mother right away started cleaning hotel rooms in downtown Chicago and in the suburbs. And my dad just kept on hearing from relatives that, in Minnesota, there's great schools, and in Minnesota there's great healthcare, and that there's like a really strong faith system, Catholic Charities and Lutheran Social Service, that were really helping Hmong people resettle in the Twin Cities. And after living in Chicago for a few years, my dad just felt like we gotta this is like, so we came in 1980, so Chicago was rough in 1980. I'm just like, and so my dad just felt like we gotta go someplace else where we can actually try to live a better life. It's been good, but I also have to acknowledge that there's great disparities even now in Minnesota, around healthcare, around education, between people of color, immigrants, and their white counterpart. But for our family, it was really great. The Hmong community here in Minneapolis is really thought of as like the cultural and intellectual community of the Hmong people around the world.
Okay, and thinking about your parents for a little bit, you're referencing just all that trauma that's come into the family from being a war refugee and the impact with your father's position. You're growing up in a camp very, very young. You guys are moving here. Now you're needing to assimilate. So we're really talking about that intergenerational trauma that comes with families who endure this kind of experience. When you think about your parents, what do you think are the highlights of what they brought into their own parenting in your family related to their experiences with all of this war trauma?
They survived as they knew how to survive, and they didn't have a roadmap or plan for survival. I think that I know this, that psychologically they've been impacted. When people think about immigration and people think about resettlement, they think of it as like a bureaucratic process. Like, did you get your papers? Did you get your green card? Where are you in this process of becoming a citizen? They don't realize that it's a psychological process too, and that it's a psychological process that's like embedded with like a state process. And sometimes the state, and here it's the United States, is not often kind, and we're in a moment where the state is not kind to people who are in that process. And so for my parents, they tried their very best. They both went to school here. They both tried to get higher education degrees. They didn't accomplish that, but they were both taking college classes at some point. And my mom's really proud that she actually decided not to get her GED, but she decided that she wanted to graduate from high school and have that kind of high school experience because she was just so young at that time. And so for them, they tried to instill within us like the qualities and the values that they had that made them successful in Laos too. Because when my dad was coming up, he was a minority, so he went to school with the French elites, with the Lao elites. They at night they went to sleep in dormitories, with comfortable beds, and my dad went to sleep in the shed with the chickens and the pigs and the outdoor dogs that kept him warm. So I think they're trying to instill with us these skills for us to survive in the United States. I don't think that they ever thought that we would become as Americanized or Westernized as we did. And I think that's, like, to them, that's a great tragedy, because they understand that we're also losing a sense of the Hmong culture, because our Hmong culture is very different than their Hmong culture, because we're different. And, some of us have married, Westerners, some of us had married Caucasian men. And I think my parents would have preferred that we actually married Hmong men. And so these are the things that they try to instill in us. But I mean, again, there was a lot of learning pains, I guess. I have to say that, because just even my role as the oldest daughter, being the oldest daughter, they expected me to go and get an education. I did eventually. I have my master's degree in education, and it was like the signal was like you have to go to school and get your education because that's the only way out of poverty. That's what they were telling me because that was my dad's experience. But at the same time, make sure you come in home right away after school, cook dinner for the entire family. I'm the oldest daughter, so make sure that you watch all of your children. I mean, all the younger kids, and help them with their homework too, because you're also ahead of them. Even though no one helps you with your homework and taught you how to speak English properly, but you now have to actually help your younger siblings. And I have there's 8 of us, so I have 7 younger siblings with their homework. And then on top of that, you have to not only go help them with the homework, but you have to go with them to the school conferences. And I remember going to their school conferences and having to actually translate for other parents who were there, other Hmong parents who were there who needed translators because their children were so young. And I remember translating for a particular woman because her son wasn't doing well. I think her son might have been in the 3rd or 4th grade. He was acting up. He wasn't doing well. And she was trying to say to him that she was the second wife of this man, her husband. And he was never there, and she was working, and there was nobody to supervise her children. But that was obviously there was a language barrier, so she just could not convey that. And I was actually sitting at a different table with a different teacher, and I was only 19. So and then finally I just was like, I can't deal with this anymore. So I turned around and I actually ended up translating for the rest of the night. But I think schools have become a lot more sophisticated. But this is, I would say, early 90s, probably 93, 94. So when you think about it, Hmong people have only really been in the United States for 20 or 15 years. And so they didn't have school translators. I ended up translating. And I've translated at doctor's office for my parents, even though they speak English at a high school level. But when you talk about those medical terms, those complex medical ideas, I don't feel like the best person to convey those things. Even 12-year-old me was doing a lot better than my parents, and there was like no translators available.
So you filling that role both in your family and in the community, can you tell us how's that shaped you now and made an impact on who you are today?
And I have worked in media most of my professional career because I want to tell that authentic narrative. I want to tell that story that often gets either told incorrectly or told incompletely or told from the dominant cultural lens. And that's one of the reasons why I believe I believe in narrative change, that we have to change the narrative of cultural communities, of immigrant communities, or underrepresented communities in the United States. And that's one of the reasons why I decided to become a journalist. I was I'm just really dating myself, but when I graduated from college, my first position was a reporter for the Pioneer Press. And at that time, there was I think 3 of us, 3 Hmong people in all the United States that was working in mainstream media. And even now, 50 years later, I think there's only 12 people that have cycled through mainstream media, but really successful, actually. So I think that there's still more Hmong people that's needed to tell our authentic story, because if we don't tell our own story, and whether you're producing it or whether you're editing it or whether you're actually the person that's going out with a camera or recorder that's actually telling that story, if we don't do it, other people are going to tell our story, and as we've known from history, that they're going to tell it incorrectly. And so that's shaped my growing up and observing those situations where people couldn't speak because they lacked the language skills, or they couldn't speak because they lacked the confidence and they became self-muted, or they couldn't speak because people in power wouldn't let them speak. It's really what drove me to decide that I want to be a storyteller.
When you think about your parents going through the war, raising 8 kids, moving here, assimilating, finding community, how did that impact their parenting and their view of mental health?
I would say that it's that we're still in the middle, that it's a continuing process. So my parents haven't come out on the other side yet, because they're still dealing with integration, they're still dealing with adaptation, they're still dealing with mental health issues, and I'm not either on the other side yet. I was lamenting to my husband yesterday that, it's like I'm 50 and I cannot believe that I still don't know if I'm still an American yet, a true American, not with the police state. And I'm 50 years old, and I still feel chronic shame and chronic depression and chronic stress and chronic anxiety, because at any given moment I'm transported back to the refugee camp. At any given moment I'm still that 15-year-old teenager, growing up in, I guess, a very low income community, I guess you could call it the hood, and having to deal with, like, am I going to join a gang? Am I going to go to this gang fight, and bring some razor blade with me to the gang fight? Or am I going to finish my homework? And am I going to read, like, Hamlet and just finish it, and turn in my paper that this is actually a real scenario, turn in my Hamlet essay and prepare myself to go and take that quiz tomorrow in English class? Or am I gonna, like, be tough and go to that gang fight and like, because these are my family, the gangs.
Yeah.
Like, these are things that, like, any given moment I am back to that place. And I know from my parents, all the trauma of being a refugee, the depression, internalizing fear, carrying the emotional labor of, look, being a mom in Minnesota right now, I've got a 16-year-old, 14-year-old, and 11-year-old. I have trauma wondering if I can make it through traffic to get them to their sports and activities. I can't imagine what my parents must feel, the quiet suffering and the trauma they must feel of the labor of trying to move their children from one country safely to another country and then set them up for success.
Yeah, let's just turn there for a minute. This ice surge into Minnesota, can you just talk about what that's bringing up for you and your parents and your siblings, and where this is putting you all?
It's traumatizing. It's horrific. I have panic attacks now, just from hearing sirens, from seeing people that are in uniform, from just having my neighbors and my own children knock on the door. Um, I have a lot of trauma and fear of being separated from my own children. Um, and then I have these flashbacks, and I know they're not my own, and I wonder if I received them from, like, just collecting stories by this emotional flashbacks of being in the jungle, even though I never experienced that, or being in the camp. The war was continuous, if you think about it, because we're in under French colonialism rule, and then there was, like, violence with that. And not a lot of people know this, but France actually overly taxed their colonies in Africa and also in Asia to pay for World War I and World War II, because that's where were they going to get the money from. And so this taxing was very difficult for the Hmong people, where Hmong people resorted to killing themselves, instead of paying their taxes, because they couldn't pay their taxes, they're going to be killed anyways, or selling their children to pay for their taxes. And so and then after the French, as the French was leaving, and then you had, like, the Americans come in right away. And my dad said that one of the reasons why he learned English is because someone told him that the Americans were our new masters. And so he thought, well, if they're our new masters, might as well learn English and French. And so for the Hmong people, the trauma didn't start at the refugee camp. It's been 300 years of like pain and trauma under I guess Western rule, and we're still carrying that today. And so for my parents, they were, and myself, were carrying 3 or 4 generations of that trauma. And then here, being now in the United States, the ICE occupation and everything from, like, people disappearing people coming to your door and really acting like the big bad wolf, knocking on your door and saying, come out, or else I'll huff and I'll puff and I'll blow your door down, and trying to take people away. So that detention without legal process, that's all what my mom had said was happening in Southeast Asia. And my mother had also talked about like you have like the imprisonment of your political rivals, and then she said after that there's usually assassinations. Like people just start getting assassinated, and that's what they saw. My mom said that they dare not even leave their house, I guess their compound, and they had like a mini army that was protecting them because they're more affluent, and so you couldn't even leave, because people were being killed, and you don't know who was behind that, though everybody suspected that it was the government. So all these things, the door knocking, people disappearing, I think it hits my parents harder because they've seen this before, and they've also told us to prepare to leave. Even last weekend, my mom called me up and told me, "Do you have $10,000? You need $10,000 that you can carry with you,
Yeah.
because that's what you're gonna need." And I just said, well, maybe, let's be a little bit more sophisticated. Maybe we could put in an offshore account or a Swiss bank account if that's really, I'm not going to be, she had to run it for life. And also when she did run for her life, she actually didn't carry any gold or anything. She just carried me, because when you're really running for your life, you're not thinking about my necklace, or my,
Yes.
my designer clothes. You're like, I'm running for my life. And so these, it's really, just traumatic for my parents. And also my parents and we talked about this idea of like, now I know that I'm not an American. I don't have the same rights, because so many Hmong people have been dragged out of their house in their underwear, even though they're citizens, have been taken, and disappeared, even though they're citizens. There are people and have never been convicted of anything. They're just disappearing, and to me this is a reminder to our family again that it doesn't matter if we're doctors and we give money to charity, and like we're trying to, we marry Western people, we're not Americans, because that our Americanism is conditional on who's in power, and we don't have the right look, to meaning we're Asian Americans. We cannot blend in, with other people. We don't have the right look to ever be considered a American. And I say that to my own children, and they're like, "God, Mom, I don't want to hear it." But I don't know if I'm passing trauma onto them by trying to have those conversations with them. And they're biracial, and I had to talk to my son and my two daughters, but especially my son, because he looks a lot like me, and he doesn't look so much like my husband, who's German and Irish. And I had to tell him, and I just was like, I can't believe you're 11, but I'm going to tell you about passing. I'm going to talk about passing to you, and that you can't pass. You don't pass. You look too much like me.
Can you explain what passing means?
Passing means the ability for people of color to present as white, so they have access to all the privileges as a white person in the larger society. And these are the kind of conversations that I never wanted to have with my children, especially that young. I was hoping that maybe they could learn it on their own through TikTok or popular culture, but because of ICE, I've had to have this conversation with him. I've also had to have a conversation with them on being safe, what it's like if someone comes and knocks on the door. What if I get taken, what they need to do, who they need to call, and I also have told them, because they know I'm a fierce, fiery kind of person. I told them I'm not going to do it. I'm not going to perform like that again. I'm going to totally comply, because I want to see, I don't want to be taken away. I want to see you again. And I know that that's really traumatic. And my son, when we had a very long conversation with him, he just broke down crying. And he was like, I don't want you to be gone. And I was like, well, the goal is for me not to be gone. But we do know people in our family that have been deported. Deported. It happened, we know people in our family who are very close to our family who've been deported. We know people who've been detained, and I have no idea where they are. We know people who have been lost in the system. I know somebody who, when they were captured by ICE, swallowed their air tags, and then were traced to the Whipple building, and within like 24 hours in Texas. And then I don't know if he kind of expelled the air tags out or what happened to him, but I mean, we know all sorts of things. So for me, being taken is like a really, that's like a real possibility. I don't think of it as will it happen. I'm thinking of it as when it happens.
And then for people who don't know, what's the Whipple building?
The headquarters of ICE operations in St. Paul and Minneapolis and the larger Minnesota community. It's also a place where people are being detained before they are shipped off into other detention centers throughout the United States.
How are you enduring through that? What kinds of, ways are you taking care of yourself through all that anxiety and that depression and that fear?
Michelle, I really wish I could say I'm taking better care of myself. I've been journaling and exercising um, and working with a few charities um, and giving to the community how I know how. But I think I could do a better job of taking care of myself. Even last night, I was just so overcome with depression and anxiety, and it was all related to ICE. And I had to,
Yes.
it, it just, I had to confront it again. And I'm not somebody, and I don't want to blame this on being Asian or being Hmong, but we're not known culturally for our confrontation. We're known
Yeah.
culturally for sweeping things under the rug and just pretending and hoping that everything would be okay. And actually, there's actually great nobility and great admiration for those who can bear it and suffer it. There's actually a Hmong phrase called usuma, which is like you just have to bear and suffer. So
Wow.
and so I try to balance that with what I know from just growing up in America, and I've seen off and on different healthcare professionals for like some quick 4 sessions, and I've seen people over an extended period of years to help me overcome some of my issues related to the refugee experience. And I know now that I need to see a mental health worker. And I said this 4 weeks ago, but I just haven't quite gotten there. And I actually don't know why. I just can't pick up the phone and make that phone call. Certainly, it's something my husband supports. And my mom supports it too. She's actually a shaman. And so this past weekend, we actually killed a pig as an offering to our ancestor so that we can be invisible to ICE. And whether you believe that or not, certainly it did help me emotionally to feel like I was healing and I was being seen by the ancestors. Though the ironic part is that when we got to the Hmong farm and slaughterhouse, that farm had been raided 3 times by ICE. And when my husband actually, I was told not to bring my husband because people would mistake him for ICE agents. And the last time and the ICE raided that farm, everybody ran into, because it's actually in a rural place. I don't want to say what it is. I don't want to bring any more ICE attention to that farm. But people, the patrons, the people that came to get their chickens and their pigs, and the people that worked in the farm just ran. And everybody, I'm sure was a citizen or some kind of had some kind of documentation, but they were just so scared. So yeah, ironically, we went to the farm to give an offering and kill a pig to the ancestors, but at the same time, we're in a space that ICE already had raided.
Yeah, that is a lot to bear. That's a lot to bear. And how are your parents right now with what's going on with ICE?
I think, I would say that they're angry. I asked my mom how she felt, and she said she feels so angry. She just feels that um, the administration, so my father and my mother, they feel slightly different. So that's why I'll start with my mom. She just feels that the administration has no regard for her as a human being, for the contributions of the Hmong people to the United States. and that we have like paid with our blood to be in this country, and she feels that this current administration has forgotten their promise, forgotten like literally our blood. Hmong soldiers as young as 11 to 14 years old carrying AK-47s that are bigger than them died and paid for their blood for us to be in this country. And so and she feels that most Hmong have actually really have adapted well, integrated themselves into America, particularly in Minnesota. She doesn't understand. She's confused. She's angry, and I think she's still in the middle of trying to reconcile that right now. But I know when I asked her, she feels like a lot of anger, and also fear too, because she remembers a few years ago around Asian hate when during the COVID-19, and she was targeted during the Asian hate, and we had people that we knew that were beaten up, or elderly people that we knew were beaten up. So she's thinking like it's violence again. Like once again, just within a few years, we're reminded that we're not Americans yet. And she is a citizen. She and my dad are both citizens, so that's where she's at. And my dad has a different approach. My dad's approach is that we just need to obey, and we need to be really quiet, and kind of fly under the radar. And so I think he thinks that that's like the best approach. But I can't imagine like that kind of internalizing that fear and that anxiety, the trauma, like what it would do. But I figured, well, he did go through a war, and he was like in the front lines of battle, and he probably has created a system that works for him, and he ran a social service nonprofit that was very successful, and so I just think that he probably has a system that works for him. I don't know if it's working for my mom, and it definitely won't work for me.
Well, there's so many different ways for people to be resilient through their trauma. And I think that you've just highlighted two very different approaches between your mom and dad and what they need to survive what's going on for them internally, externally. And there's no one way to manage the trauma that we have. And our bodies and our minds tend to know how to protect us through that trauma. And I just, give a lot of grace for people who have to find their own way of managing that trauma, because what you're describing again is not just current, it's pulling in generations of that trauma already being present in the family's experience and in the family line. So everybody's got to find their way through it. And no judgment on that at all.
I had to learn that the hard way, because with eight of us, we all had to come to reconcile our experiences as refugee children, and we did it in different ways. So I believe everything you said, Michelle, is that we arrive. I hope that we all arrive to the same destination, but taking different paths and perhaps taking different vehicles, and there's like no right or wrong way. And but what angers me, the angers me too, and actually I have to say I feel my mom's anger is that um, I know I'm passing on my trauma to my children, and I could have done it subtly, and it would have happened anyways, I think. But this whole ICE situation, and then with COVID and Asian hate, now I feel like I'm really throwing it down to them. Like I think I could have given them like maybe like a little bag, and now I feel like I'm giving them luggage cases, to carry through their life.
Well, yeah, I mean, who knows what they'll say when they're 50 years old looking back. Certainly, I don't think there's a way for you not to bring trauma in, because it's not you bringing it. It's the culture, it's society, it's the world we're living in right now is bringing that trauma. You, as a parent, as an individual, are trying to figure out how to manage through that. Have you found any little gems like that as you've talked with your son. And do you just have one son, or do you have other children too?
I have three children. So I
You have
have
three children.
two daughters, and so the eldest is 16, and then the middle child is 14, and my son's 11. He's gonna
11,
turn
okay.
12 next month. And with regard to trying to find those gems, I just know instinctively that art and whether that's music or drawing or
Yeah.
painting or journaling, that's been helpful for me. And so I've been trying to encourage my children. I don't want to call it art therapy because I don't know any
Yeah.
of the science behind it, but my husband has been doing something else. I really it was my idea, really encourage my children, my husband, to take our children just to the health club. And so
Yeah.
we have a family membership, and he takes them consistently. I go like once or twice a week, but he takes them almost every other night, and sometimes every night when we can, just so they can have that physical release. And instinctively we know that that's good for them to deal with pain, and to not like to have a release for that trauma that they could internalize. I wish I could talk to my children more about what's happened, but what when I talk to my children, I usually end up just like a mess. I'm crying. Um, and I can see my children rolling their eyes, and I feel like they're judging me. But I don't know if I have the right language, because being Hmong, we don't have a language for like a lot of the mental health issues that we know exist. There's certain our language is we have a beautiful language, by the way, but it's limiting because we don't have specific words for like bipolar disorder. We
Yeah.
just say he's crazy. We don't have we don't, but also we don't have a word for art. Because art is like art for art's sake is totally a Western concept. Like we come from a culture of utilitarian art, where you're creating art, because you need it. So there's just, and I feel like because I never had the language, even though I myself had seen healthcare workers, or have used healthcare, in the past, mental health, um, uh, you know, services in the past, I don't have the language to even talk with them. I guess I could buy a book.
Yeah, you certainly could. And if I can just really simplify it too, I think the best recipe is to always just say what you're thinking and feeling and just being authentic about it. Even if you're having a hard time getting through it, even if you're struggling through it, our kids need to just know how our parents are thinking and feeling, even if it sounds sloppy and messy, and because that's the genuine connection that kids need through the trauma.
Hmm.
So if we don't have the big fancy words or the right language or the just being authentic and talking about why you're crying or talking about why you're having a hard time getting through things is enough to teach our children that, wow, there is connection, there is meaning behind this, there is a reason for these feelings and thoughts.
I never even thought to give them the explanation of the why behind it. I should just I should, yeah, tell them that these are coping skills that I know works for me, intrinsically, and I wanted to, you know, pass that on to them. I never even thought about that. But those are really great
Yeah.
suggestions.
What have you tried to keep sacred that came from your family of origin? And then we'll talk about what you would like to leave behind.
So I think one of the most beautiful things about our culture is really our sense of community. Um, and that's, in the Hmong culture, and with Hmong people, I think that's how we survived. Being mountain people, we stuck, with ourselves. And I see that in the United States, different versions of that. Certainly, we're not tight as a community as we used to be, but shows up, the way that families help each other, in the way that we still respect our elders. The Hmong culture is not a youth orientated culture. If you
Mhm.
grow older, then yeah, it's almost like you get brownie points, for your age because you have lived the experience. So it's not a very youthful culture, and that's one of the things I really appreciate about the culture too, is that the reverence and the respect that we have for our elders. Not saying they're perfect, but just that to me is something that I actually want to keep too. Another, I guess, the last thing I have to say is that the Hmong culture is known for beautiful storytelling, and certainly that has really influenced my writing. I'm not gonna get emotional about it. Um, so you might have learned that the Hmong people actually are an oral culture, so just that oral history, that beautiful storytelling that people told each other, you know, 1,000 years ago by the fireside. We're still telling the same stories, and I hope that I'm carrying that storytelling tradition because I have the opportunity to now be writing it down. There's certainly nothing wrong with oral history, and I do a lot of that work too. But to actually write it down and to be, I think, one of the first people to be writing down Hmong oral history for the first time, I feel like I'm doing a really important work. With regards to, I think some of the things that I don't want to carry with me is that it's actually a very patriarchal culture. And for me to pretend that it's not is not truthful. And so I'm actually really proud that there are people like, other writers, people who are in healthcare, like my siblings, who are doctors and dentists, who are actually breaking that barrier and, claiming their voice, creating their own story, making decisions for themselves, being self sufficient, and not having to rely on, a man or their family or their clan for livelihood. And so there are certain things that are changing too. And also, I don't, in terms of that youth culture, I think that the Hmong community is now more aware that maybe young people like have something to share, and something to say, and that's actually a good thing that's changing too, because in the Hmong culture, traditionally you weren't a man until you were married. And so if you like, you could be a 30-year-old bachelor and still be sitting with a little kid at the little kid table, or you could be a 16-year-old man because you got married when you were 15 or 16. So I think that those things are changing, and I'm happy they're changing.
What do you really cherish from the family dynamics that you've learned that you want to keep continuing forward in your family and raising your children? And then what family dynamics would you rather not carry forward?
That's actually really difficult to answer. One of the things I'm really proud of with our family is that people are able to speak their truth. I think that that's really powerful, and that my children are not afraid to express their truth, to about how they're feeling about school, their friends, um, and I that's important to me. That I hope that in allowing them to express to their father and I, that they feel that they can also express to their classmates, to their teachers, and really advocate for themselves. Because growing up, I didn't have those tools, and I think I might have gone kind of like, because I was always that person in class in the 11th grade who was like asking like asinine question because I just wanted to be heard. Because for so long in the Hmong culture and also in the American culture, you being an Asian young girl and then now an Asian woman, it's like, you know, there was a lot of stereotypes about Asian women, and also we weren't expected to be heard. And so I just held that with me, and I want my children to like people to hear them, but also for them to hear themselves, and think that their voice is important, that it matters, and that they can contribute to their little circle or to the larger society. One of the things that I actually want to stop doing is I have all these expectations of my children that I think is really about my Asian identity. The worst thing that an Asian parent can hear about from their children is actually that they got an A minus. And so I have a lot of like expectations around my children's academics that um, my parents put on me, because it was
Yeah.
either like getting an A plus um, or else you're worthless. And so these are the things. I'm certainly not as harsh to my children, as I think my parents were to me around my academics. But I understand that I'm putting a lot of pressure on them academically. But then I tell myself, and I tell my husband this, is that I like grew up in poverty and with carrying the trauma of war, and I end up getting an A+ and actually skipping a grade when I was young.
Wow.
And they have nothing, I mean, to worry about. They have everything, they have like a bed, they have like their Xbox, they get to go, especially for my teenage daughters, they get to go to Ulta and Sephora, and buy makeup to try the latest TikTok makeup trends. And they should just be happy, and they don't have like all the responsibilities that I have of translating and cooking and cleaning. And my husband says, don't be so hard on them, because the world is going to take care of them. The world's going to find a way to actually break them down, because that's his philosophy, and we just need to support them. And I think he's right.
Ka, thank you so much for being so open about all your experiences. I really appreciate it.
I do appreciate you having me on. I really do. I think more people in the Hmong community should and need the tools to talk about mental health. And I'm hoping that this session with you today, or our conversation today, is going to help with that. And I know I'm going to share this podcast in Hmong social media, but I think it's just something that's really important for my community to deal with.
In This Family is presented by Nexus Family Healing, a national nonprofit mental health organization. You can learn more about Nexus and how to support our mission at nexusfamilyhealing.org. You can read Ka's columns at startribune.com, and I highly recommend that you do that. Wonderful columns about immigration and community. Search there for Ka Vang, again, Kavang. The show is produced by John Moe with music from Jeremy Messer-Smith. If you liked what you heard, be sure to subscribe, rate, and write a review.